What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup because I've got ADHD, so doing something with my hands while I talk helps me not trail off into oblivion. At least not as often. So if you're interested in true crime and you like makeup and you'd like to hear some very interesting cases filtered through my neurodivergent thunderdome of a brain, then perhaps consider subscribing. I do know that the makeup thing is a deal breaker for some people, which is fine, but I don't talk about it as I'm doing it. I don't flash products on the screen or anything like that. I actually try really hard not to let it be a distraction to the actual story, but if you're still against it, I do understand. So I always make sure to list some more traditional true crime creators as well as media resources down in the description box that you can turn to instead if you're still interested in hearing the story, just not from me. And with all of that said and done, for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. All right, so today's case is another request. I know that I said I was going to do them every other week, but one, I don't think I've really done a good job of that anyways. And two, when this one was brought to my attention, considering that it was solved so recently and it's absolutely crazy, I had to cover it. So thank you so much to Elena for requesting this one. I think that it is such an important story that paves the way for multiple different important discussions. This all took place in 1975, and aside from the initial investigation, for the most part, it sat ice cold for almost 50 years. And it is truly crazy to me when cases that old, all of a sudden pop up solved. It truly goes to show that you never know who might come forward or what might come out that ends up breaking these cold cases wide open and leading to them being solved. Anyways, without further ado, let's talk about Marple Township's greatest tragedy. This is the story of Gretchen Harrington. Gretchen Eleanor Harrington was born in Pope County, Minnesota on June 13th, 1967, to her parents Harold and Ina Harrington. She was the couple's third of four daughters. She had two older sisters. Zoe was the oldest. She was 3 years older. And then Harriet was 2 years older. And then there was Gretchen. And at the time our story takes place, Gretchen herself had just become a big sister as well to Harold and Ina's final daughter, Jessica. Now, from what I was able to find, the three oldest girls had been born in Minnesota, but right around the time that Gretchen turned 1, Harold and Ina packed up their girls, they packed up their life, and they moved 1,300 miles from Pope County, Minnesota to Delaware County, Pennsylvania. Specifically, they moved into a tiny little community called Broomall, which is located in Marple Township in Delaware County. And the reason for this move was that Gretchen's father, Harold Harrington, was actually more well known as Reverend Harrington. Harold had been ordained as a minister in 1951 following his completion of seminary school, and following his ordainment, Harold went on to lead several congregations of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America. His ministerial career began in 1954 when he was installed as the pastor of the Newcastle, Pennsylvania congregation. He served in Newcastle until 1961, which is when he then moved to Arizona to work with the church's Security Commission, and he was there from 1961 to 1964. Harold married Ina about a year after he'd moved to Arizona, and in 1964, the couple moved yet again, this time to Lake Reno, Minnesota, where Harold had been tasked with taking over a new congregation. And then obviously we know that they remained there until 1967. That's where they started their family, and that brings us back to the big move from Minnesota to Pennsylvania, which, as I'm sure you've likely guessed by now, was for Harold to take over yet another new church. This time it was Broomall Reformed Presbyterian Church, and based on what I could gather, it kind of seems like at the time this church needed Harold more than Harold needed this church. And I say that because in the book that I read about this case, which is where I got the lion's share of my information that I'll be presenting to you today, Reverend Bill Edgar, who preceded Harold as the Broomall Church's pastor, is quoted as saying, "For 2 years, my congregation tried calling one star after another, but none were interested in our small, aging planet." However, when the Broomall Church reached out to Harold, he happily accepted the position, and he was installed as the church's new pastor on June 19th, 1968. The Harringtons moved into a small brick Cape Cod-style home located at 27 Lawrence Road, just over a mile from the Broomall Reformed Presbyterian Church that Harold would now be leading. And this little house in this tiny little community, Broomall, would be where Gretchen would spend the majority of her short life. Gretchen was a sweet, funny, playful little girl who loved being outside. She loved playing baseball and she loved kickball. She had a lot of friends. However, it did take her a while to warm up to people and to feel comfortable around them. She was very shy and very reserved when it came to strangers and to people that she didn't know all that well. But once she was familiar with you, that's when the outgoing, witty, real Gretchen came out. A lot of those who were friends with Gretchen recall that she was always dressed really nice, that she always looked fairly put together. Although her sister Harriet, who, by the way, goes by Anne, would tend to tease her about her tendency to mix patterns and textures in, let's call it, an unconventional way. Either way, though, despite how she looked, one thing was for sure, and that was whether she was in a dress or not, Gretchen could effortlessly keep up with the boys at recess. She was quite sporty. Her friends would actually describe her as a bit of a tomboy, which is something that I can totally relate to. I swear I had like a massive identity crisis when I was little, because one day I would want to wear a dress and a bow in my hair, and then the next day I would literally want to dress like a boy. And I grew up in the 90s, so neither option looked good.
Oh my God! What are those?
Gretchen, on the other hand, was genuinely adorable. She was a happy girl from a good family, and even though Ina and Harold did have some slightly stricter rules for their daughters to follow than some of the other parents did, for example, no TV and no playing outside on Sundays, but all in all, the Harringtons were a close-knit, loving, cute little happy family. And honestly, what else would you expect from a pastor's family in the 70s? They were a wholesome family living in a wholesome neighborhood. Everyone around was very religious. Everyone was friendly. Everybody knew everybody, and nobody locked their doors. I mean, it's the same song and dance that we've been through so many times before. And honestly, the book that I read to prepare for this video, Marple's Gretchen Harrington Tragedy, which I'll have linked below, the author, Joanna Sullivan, and her co-author, Mike Mathis, I'll tell you what, they made me look at this whole, like, safety of simpler times type trope that we always hear in these cases completely differently. They pointed out just how crazy it is that throughout the decades that the US had the most active serial killers, and from what I could find, some of the highest rates of violent crime, that's when people felt the most safe. That's when people just stayed sleeping with their doors wide open. It was definitely wild to finally have somebody put that into perspective for me. And this next thing is a conversation that I've had with my husband so many different times. And that is the world actually scarier now than it was 40 to 50 years ago? Or do we just have access to more scary information now than we did 40 to 50 years ago? Personally, I think it's a little bit of both. But before I get off on a massive tangent, let's bring it back to where we need to be. Gretchen, like most of the other residents of Broomall, felt as though she lived in a safe town. She felt secure. Her family felt safe and secure. It was a town that no one could have possibly ever imagined was housing a disgusting, horrible, just vile monster. And not only was this man living among them, but he was parading around right in front of their faces, operating as one of the most trusted men in town. And that, my friends, brings us to the morning of Friday, August 15th, 1975. That summer of 1975, two of the Broomall churches, Reformed Presbyterian, which we know was run by Gretchen's father, in conjunction with the Trinity Chapel, which was a neighboring church led by a man named David Zanstra. Together, the two churches ran sort of a split Bible study program for the kids to attend throughout the summer. The churches actually sat on adjoining properties, so it was super easy and super convenient for the children to split their time between the two buildings. The children would report to Trinity Chapel at 9:30 for the first half of the class, and then from there they would make their way to Reformed Presbyterian, where they would finish out classes for the day. And while all three of the Harrington girls had attended this summer camp, Gretchen in particular had not missed a single day throughout throughout the entire duration. So although Harold and Ina had just welcomed baby Jessica, Gretchen's new little sister, into the world the day before on August 14th, 1975, in an effort not to disrupt her perfect attendance, Harold suggested that Gretchen, instead of staying home with the rest of the family that day, that she instead proceed to Bible study as planned. And I have to admit that initially this kind of took me back. Like, why would you want your whole family together besides one of your daughters for something as special as the first day you bring a newborn baby into the family? But then I checked myself, I checked my snap judgments, and I tried to think about it objectively. Both Zoe and Anne had experienced this before. They'd both already experienced their parents bringing home a new baby. So it was something that they were familiar with. But this would be Gretchen's first time becoming a big sister. This is the first time she's ever going through all of these emotions and the first time that she's ever experiencing not being the baby. And it's actually recommended that when you bring a new baby home, you try to keep the older siblings' routine as regular as possible. You know, you want the situation to be as minimally jarring as possible. Give the older siblings as few reasons as possible to resent the new sibling straight out the womb. Maybe Gretchen didn't want to miss Bible study. Maybe she was really proud of her perfect attendance and she didn't want to lose it. Maybe Harold wanted to give Gretchen a day away to cope with the news that she'd had yet another sister the day before. I'm sure Gretchen would have grown to absolutely adore her little sister, but it was well known that Gretchen was really hoping for a little brother. So maybe initially she was a little disappointed, and Harold figured that a day away might help her cope with and accept the news. Remember, she's only 8 years old, so it would be perfectly reasonable for her to have been a little disappointed. Christ, there are adults that get disappointed when they don't end up having the gender of baby that they want. At any rate, though, for whatever reason, which we'll probably never know, Harold did encourage Gretchen to keep her routine and to head to Bible study, which she did. Typically, the three sisters would walk the half mile from their home at 27 Lawrence Road south to 144 Lawrence Road together. But, as we've discussed, Gretchen was the only one of the Harrington children that was going to be attending church that day, so this time she would be making the trip alone. And please understand that I say trip very loosely because it was only like a 10, maybe 15-minute walk. And all the other kids were going to be walking that same way at that same time. The girls had been doing it all summer. So I have to imagine that the Harringtons didn't even give the idea of Gretchen walking there alone a second thought. Harold watched as his daughter walked up the street, out of sight, towards the church and towards Bible study, likely looking so forward not only to seeing her at his church in a few hours, but to seeing her come home and really get to interact with her new baby sister for the first time. It was such an exciting time in the Harrington family. And having lived it myself, there is nothing quite like the first time your entire family is together following the birth of a new baby. It is so magical and so special, and I have to assume that it was a moment that the Harringtons had been looking forward to since Ina initially learned that she was pregnant with their fourth child. But sadly, it was a moment that they would never get to experience. And honestly, the entire newborn phase of Jessica's life was robbed from the Harringtons, as was life as they knew it overall. In Gretchen's sister's words, after that day, life for the Harrington family irrevocably changed, because just a few short moments after Harold Harrington turned around and went back inside after sending his now second youngest daughter off to Bible study, Gretchen Eleanor Harrington would be abducted right off of the street, taken to a secluded location, and murdered in cold blood. However, it would take months for the Harringtons, as well as the other residents of Broomall, to learn the details surrounding Gretchen's tragic fate. Now, I've seen conflicting information surrounding how and when Gretchen was actually reported missing. Some reports say that Harold was the first person to realize that Gretchen was missing when some of her Bible study friends showed up at his church around 1 p.m. that afternoon without her. However, other records say that Reverend Zanstra, the pastor of the other church, evidently he claimed that he was the one to inform Harold that Gretchen was missing just after 11 that morning. Apparently, one of the other Bible school teachers had mentioned to him that Gretchen had never shown up for class. So I'm not exactly sure who was the first person to truly recognize the fact that Gretchen was missing, but either way, Gretchen was ultimately reported missing, and everyone that day remembers a very tangible shift in the Broomall environment. In the blink of an eye, the once peaceful, quiet town turned into a panicked and chaotic scene. Although no one knew for sure what had even happened yet, there was still definitely like an ominous wave of urgency that washed over the town. Harold, in particular, was immediately sure that something terrible had happened because Gretchen would never have voluntarily missed Bible study. He also knew, though, that she would have never gotten in the car with a stranger. She was way too shy and too nervous around new people. So pretty much right away, the working theory was that Gretchen had been forcibly taken by someone on her way to the church. As word spread that Gretchen was missing, a massive, widespread search for her began. Marple Police and Fire were actually joined by Haverford Police and Fire as the search initially began. However, those numbers multiplied exponentially as seemingly minute by minute, more and more community members showed up ready to help. I think in total, there was somewhere close to, if not slightly over, 300 people searching for Gretchen. People took her disappearance, as well as this effort to find her, incredibly seriously and incredibly personally. Obviously, I mentioned earlier that Broomall was a tiny community where everyone knew each other, so it was not difficult for people to empathize with the Harringtons and to feel their pain and to feel their worry. It could have just as easily been any of their children, their grandchildren, their sister, their cousin. Therefore, the community came out in full force to show their support and to try and help bring Gretchen home. They searched all of the neighborhoods, they searched the woods. Police dispatched a search helicopter to perform an aerial search. They brought in a bloodhound unit to hopefully track her scent. And the search wore on like this for 3 days. Aside from the bloodhounds, they were called off on Saturday. Gretchen went missing on Friday, and by Saturday it had rained, so the time frame that the dogs could have picked up her scent and then followed her scent had unfortunately passed. But beyond that, police, fire, and community volunteers gave the search everything they could for just under 72 hours. I mean, they looked high and low for this little girl, but despite their exhaustive efforts, they simply could not find any trace of Gretchen. The formal search for her, though, was called off on Sunday, which was a really difficult pill for everyone to swallow. It was like admitting defeat, admitting that there was nothing else left that they could do. The chief of police tried to convince everyone that they would continue working diligently to find Gretchen, but he was also transparent with them. He flat out told them that they didn't have a clue what had happened to her. Their investigative trail had very quickly grown cold. Sure, they got a few additional tips and leads along the way, mostly regarding different vehicles people had seen in the area. Whether they were unfamiliar or just a little sus, I'm not really sure. I know that there was a 1950s vintage white vehicle that they were looking into at one point, and there was also a green pickup truck that they'd looked into. But just like the searches of the area, the investigation into these vehicles and their owners never really panned out. They still had no idea where Gretchen went or what had happened to her. And as time passed, hope gradually dwindled that Gretchen would ever be seen again. I think initially people wanted to believe that she'd been kidnapped and that somehow she would end up being returned and that she would be unharmed. But the more time that passed without any information coming forward, no ransom demands or anything like that, people gradually started to believe that Gretchen had likely met with foul play. By the end of September, tips had stopped coming in altogether. Most of the remaining search efforts had dwindled, and pretty much everyone across the board had lost hope. One detective actually got so desperate for information that he independently contacted a psychic in hopes of getting some supernatural insight into the case. Sadly, though, the only information the psychic was able to provide was that Gretchen was no longer with us. She couldn't tell him how she died, when she died, or where she was. She just simply told him that she was gone. Meanwhile, the Harringtons were living through what I have to imagine was the most jarring juxtaposition of feelings that anyone could think of. On one hand, they had just brought home this beautiful new baby, their last baby. That in and of itself is incredibly emotional. It's something that should be savored and really soaked in and cherished. And then on the other hand, simultaneously, they've endured this unimaginable earth-shattering tragedy, clawing their way through the day-to-day and trying to navigate their absolute devastation. And they're sleep-deprived. And they have to try and mitigate their older daughter's fear and sadness from losing their sister. Wow. I can barely handle a normal range of daily emotions, so I do not understand how anyone keeps it together under circumstances like this. I guess that's where that one phrase comes from. What is it? You don't know how strong you are until you have to be, something like that. I guess that's where that comes from. And while I'm sure that the Harringtons did their absolute best, it should go without saying that balancing these emotions and frankly just surviving this situation, they really struggled a lot. The whole community did, but for the Harringtons specifically, Zoe and Anne, Gretchen's older sisters, they distinctly remember that following Gretchen's disappearance, everything changed in their lives forever. And I feel like that's a really obvious thing to say, but to clarify, they went from a normal, happy, all-American family, whatever that means, to broken fragments of what they once knew. Following Gretchen's disappearance, Anne remembers that Harold was seemingly always on the phone, and Ina just completely lost herself. She became quiet and withdrawn, and they never really got their old selves back. There was a very stark dichotomy between life with Gretchen and life without Gretchen, and this extended to the entire community. They almost used Gretchen's disappearance as a way to signify time. Like, they grouped events as either before Gretchen or after Gretchen. Kind of like BC and AD. Before Gretchen's disappearance, everything in Broomall was easy breezy and lighthearted. Everyone felt safe and secure. Basically, everyone was blissfully ignorant to how truly terrifying the world could be. It wasn't until after Gretchen's disappearance that a lot of the people in Broomall, especially the children, actually woke up to that fact. To the fact that you can't trust everyone. Sometimes not even your neighbors, because if this tragedy proved anything, it was that evil people can live among us and blend in with us terrifyingly easily. Often you don't know who they are, and sometimes you don't find out until it's too late. And as if fear hadn't overtaken Broomall enough just following Gretchen's disappearance, things were about to get significantly more terrifying. It was Tuesday, October 14th, 1975, almost exactly 2 months after Gretchen had gone missing, when a Philadelphia Naval Yard sailor, Andrew Van Dyke, stumbled across a tiny set of human remains while out on a jog. Ridley Creek State Park is located in Delaware County. It encompasses more than 2,600 acres of woodlands and meadows, and it is less than 10 miles from where Gretchen's family's little brick house sat. Andrew frequently hiked through this park, and obviously this day was no exception. He'd arrived at the park right around 3:30 p.m. He'd parked his car in a parking lot across the street. It was the parking lot for the Ridley Creek State Park Colonial Farm, which is a historic site that recreates farm life from approximately 1760 to 1790. He parked, he got out of his car, crossed the road, and made his way up a hill to a nearby picnic area, and then crossed Sandy Flash Drive to the hiking path that he was planning to jog. And he was only on the trail for like a couple of minutes before he discovered the remains of this tiny body. At first, from a distance, he noticed what appeared to be bones on the trail, which he assumed were animal. However, when he got closer, he not only saw clothing, but he was also able to make the distinction that the remains had human fingernails. And it was at that point that he ran off and tracked down a park ranger to call the police. And while obviously a medical examiner would have to identify the remains as Gretchen's at a later date via dental records, it didn't change the fact that as soon as police arrived at the scene, they were fairly certain that they'd finally found the little girl. Since her disappearance, Gretchen's missing posters had been plastered all over Broomall and the surrounding area, and these posters detailed exactly what she had been wearing the morning she'd gone missing. A blue and white short-sleeve striped shirt, dark blue shorts, and blue sneakers. And everyone had memorized that particular outfit during the initial searches for Gretchen immediately following her disappearance. So when police discovered those same clothes near the skeletal remains, they were pretty sure that it was her. A hunch that dental records did ultimately confirm. Gretchen's autopsy revealed that her cause of death had been blunt force trauma to the head, as in this poor little 8-year-old girl who weighed no more than 60 pounds had been hit in the head by something so hard that it had fractured her skull. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, due to the advanced level of decomposition of her remains, the coroner was unable to determine much else about what Gretchen had been through. Specifically, the coroner was unable to definitively determine if Gretchen had been sexually assaulted. Investigators did feel as though it was likely that she had, though, given that her clothing had been almost in a intentional neat pile next to her body, as if her killer had undressed her and neatly laid her clothing off to the side. You know, like a fucking sicko. Now, up to this point, the investigation into Gretchen's disappearance had been primarily handled by the Marple police. However, given that her body was discovered in a state park, well, this drew in the Pennsylvania State Police. Gretchen's body was found abandoned in an area that was thick with knee-high weeds, tall grass, small trees, and bushes. And I don't want this to sound bad, but it was kind of the perfect spot for the sicko who did this to her to choose. It was accessible enough that the killer could have definitely driven their vehicle basically right up to where they dumped her, but it was also secluded enough that she would not have easily been seen from probably even a slight distance due to the aforementioned weeds, grass, trees, and bushes. And although it had taken them 2 months to find her, given all the overgrowth, police were now pretty certain that Gretchen had been killed the very same day that she'd been abducted. They theorized that she'd been grabbed off the road around 9:20 and that she'd likely been dead before noon. It was such a crushing blow to the entire community. Sure, they'd all kind of started to think that this was likely where the situation was headed, but that didn't mean that everyone wasn't holding out hope for some sort of a miracle. A lot of the kids that lived in Broomall at the time, all obviously adults now, but a lot of them back then on that day, the day that Gretchen was found, they view that as the day that their childhood ended. And even though as time wore on, obviously everyone moved on, like I've mentioned, that day completely changed the community forever. Before this, these children played outside until dark. They rode their bikes alone to their friends' houses. They walked to the stores together to get candy. Shoot, half the time their parents didn't even know where they were. They sent them off to play with their friends in the morning, without a care in the world, knowing that if nothing else, they would always show back up for dinner. But after Gretchen disappeared, and certainly after her body was discovered, these once carefree children, they were scared. And honestly, their parents may have been more scared than they even were. But on that note, I am real quick going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, we will dive into the investigation surrounding Gretchen's murder. Don't go nowhere. All right, so after Gretchen was found, the area that she was discovered in became almost a landmark of sorts. While some of the children were terrified to even go in the park because now in their minds they associated it as a place where bad things happened, others sought out where she had been found. They carved her name into some of the surrounding trees and they kind of turned it into almost like a shrine to Gretchen. However, although some of the kids thought of this as a place to visit Gretchen, her older sisters, Zoe and Anne, actually always felt as though they didn't have a proper place to visit or to mourn their sister. There was a funeral in Broomall. I assume that it took place at Reverend Harrington's church. However, Reverend Zanstra would ultimately end up presiding over the service. From there, though, once her remains were released back to them, Harold and Ina opted to have Gretchen transported to Michigan, where the Harringtons actually owned a family burial plot. And I have to imagine that this decision didn't come easily to Harold and Ina, but given the media sensation that the story had become, they felt as though this was kind of the only way to keep people from visiting Gretchen's grave, as if it were some sort of like twisted tourist attraction. So they had her buried in Michigan so that she could rest peacefully, far, far away from the scene of her tragic death. And speaking of the scene of Gretchen's death, following the discovery of her remains, police spent days searching in the park in hopes of finding something, anything of importance that might help them identify who was responsible for this heinous crime. They interviewed people who lived in the area. They also interrogated the area's known sex offenders. They had a 24-hour tip line set up at one point, but no matter how hard they tried, they could not seem to come up with any substantial leads. There was one man whom investigators seemed to really hone in on, a man that they seemed to really believe had a high likelihood of being connected to Gretchen's death, and that was a local man named Richard Bailey. Richard was a convicted sex offender whose crimes were historically violent and historically targeted towards young girls. There were even interviews that police had conducted with some of the residents of Broomall that implicated Richard in Gretchen's abduction, claiming that they saw him or his vehicle in the area the morning she went missing. Richard Bailey had lived in the area all his life, with his criminal career beginning not long after he'd graduated high school. One of his first arrests took place in October of 1971, resulting in probation. And while I'm not 100% sure of the specifics of that case, the book I read on Gretchen's case did say that the 1971 charges were similar to charges he received in 1973 when he was charged with the kidnapping and rape of a 9-year-old girl, a crime that obviously displays some eerie similarities to Gretchen's case. Richard, who by 1973 was 26, married, and working for a finance company, had apparently abducted this 9-year-old girl from her house, assaulted her in his car, and then released her in Southwest Philadelphia. And I'm not sure how much time he served for this conviction, but I do know that 3 years later, in 1976, he pled guilty to another rape, this time of an 11-year-old girl, for which he was sentenced to 26 to 52 years in prison. So given his history and the fact that while in prison, Richard was determined to commit these crimes against children as a way to bolster his ego, it's easy to see why there was so much suspicion surrounding him in particular when it came to Gretchen's case. Coincidentally, as it would turn out, Richard actually was in the area at the time that Gretchen was abducted. According to his employment records at the time, Richard was employed as a maintenance worker at the Park Lane East apartment complex. And on the day that Gretchen went missing, sometime before noon, he was at a local tractor business located only about a mile away from where Gretchen was taken. Because of this, police actually brought Richard's work truck in for forensic examination, and they did determine that the truck had fragments of dried weeds stuck to it that were identical to typical varieties found in the area where Gretchen's body had been discovered. This, coupled with a statement from a friend of Richard's who claimed that after Gretchen's body was discovered, Richard was open in his curiosity regarding how much evidence police would need to catch the perpetrator, as well as Richard seeming to have an extensive knowledge of the injuries Gretchen sustained. Let's just say he definitely wasn't helping the argument for his innocence. And police worked tirelessly on this lead. They put a lot of effort into trying to connect Richard to Gretchen's murder. However, they simply could not do it. Even right up until his death, I'd say that a majority of the Marple police officers who worked on Gretchen's case believed that Richard Bailey was responsible for her death. Richard died of natural causes on November 4th, 2013, while incarcerated at the State Correctional Institute at Laurel Highlands in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. And even after his passing, after almost 40 years of trying and failing to connect this man to Gretchen's murder, a former Marple officer was quoted in 2018 as saying, quote, "Unfortunately, I think the guy that died in prison a few years ago probably got away with it." The guy being Richard Bailey. But spoiler alert, while he definitely was a disgusting predator, and it's for the best that he spent most of his life in and died in prison, but when it came to Gretchen's crime in particular, Richard Bailey was innocent. And although they were few and far between, police did follow up on every other credible lead and tip they received regarding Gretchen, but unfortunately, over the years, the tips stopped coming in, the leads dried up, and eventually, Gretchen's case went ice cold. There was some restored hope that the case might pick back up in late 1983 when an anonymous handwritten letter was mailed to the Marple police. In this letter, the writer, who chose to stay anonymous, noted that she knew the case well because she had children that had gone to school with Gretchen and her sisters, and she claimed that she had been plagued over the years because she was familiar with the family of an alleged child and she had deliberately never brought this man to police's attention. At the time Gretchen was found, the writer didn't come forward to police because she didn't want to cause the man's family any problems or any embarrassment. However, over the years, she couldn't stop thinking about the man, and she couldn't stop wondering if perhaps he had something to do with what happened to Gretchen. She then went on to provide police the man's name, as well as where she believed that he was currently working. And she urged police to look into this man, provided they hadn't done so already. The woman then went on to apologize for not providing her identity, and she asked the police to keep the letter out of the media as she still had some sort of vested interest in protecting this man's family. After it was received, there was a public appeal made for the writer of the letter to contact the department and to come to them with any more information. Gretchen, but despite these pleas, the author of the letter never came forward. The lead was still looked into though, but the police were unable to find any connection between this man and what had happened to Gretchen. And spoiler alert again, the man wasn't involved. That's why I personally didn't include his name here in the video. I have absolutely no idea if he truly was a child molester. I don't know if he's actually guilty of anything, so I am not comfortable alleging anything against him publicly without being able to verify the information. Over the years, the Harrington girls, as well as Ina and Harold, began to lose all hope of ever seeing a resolution to Gretchen's case. And Gretchen's father, Harold, would end up passing away in November of 2021, and sadly, he just barely missed the resolution and the solving of his daughter's case. He died without any closure and without the ability to face his daughter's killer. However, towards the end of this story, you might have conflicting feelings regarding how you feel about that, which I'll explain when we get there. Harold was 94 at the time of his passing, leaving behind his 3 remaining daughters, Zoe, Anne, and Jessica, as well as his beloved wife of 59 years, Ina. Harold was laid to rest at Washington Crossing National Cemetery, located in Newtown, Pennsylvania. And while prior to his death, Anne and her daughter had thrown around the idea of creating a memorial for Gretchen somewhere nearby. That way they would finally have a closer place to go to honor and to remember their late sister/aunt. When Harold passed away and was laid to rest, Anne actually felt as though his grave could serve as a place to pay respects to him as well as to Gretchen now. Which, God, this story is so sad, but I did find that so heartwarming that Anne was able to find some comfort after losing her father in being able to feel closer to Gretchen at his gravesite. I don't know, my sister is my absolute best friend in the world. Well, alongside my best friend, who's my soul sister. But I could not imagine losing either of them. I have like a visceral physical reaction just to the thought. So it really does warm my heart for Anne to be able to feel just a little bit closer to the sister that she so tragically lost in such a horrific and brutal way. I feel like at the very least, she deserves that. A place to go and to honor and to remember for Gretchen. Over the years, the Marple Police Department, the Pennsylvania State Police Department, as well as the Delaware County District Attorney's Office have desperately tried to revive Gretchen's case. District Attorney Jack Stolzmeyer released a statement last year stating, quote, "There is someone out there who knows exactly what happened. There are probably more people who know what happened. If they would come forward, that would be a wonderful thing. Come forward. Release the family of this young girl of this purgatory by letting them know what happened." The Marple police station has kept almost a notorious box labeled Gretchen Harrington, containing all of the police reports, interview transcripts, photos, and other pertinent documents associated with this case. The box has been passed down over the decades from detective to detective, each new set of eyes hoping to somehow catch something that everyone else before them had missed. However, sadly, no one has ever seemed to. The case haunted the Marple Police Department, Broomall, and Delaware County as a whole for almost 5 decades. For almost 50 years, Gretchen's case sat open and cold, almost taunting them, for 48 years. And if you're doing the math, 1975 plus 48 does indeed equal 2023. Meaning, yes, Gretchen's case was solved this year, almost 5 whole decades later. It was January of this year that a woman came forward alleging that when she was just 10 years old, she'd woken up during a sleepover at her friend's house to find that her friend's dad had been groping her in her sleep, which is just horrifying and vile, and the exact reason that my kids aren't allowed to sleep at other people's houses. When the girl told her friend about it the next morning, her friend being the man's daughter, she simply responded by telling her that, oh yeah, that happens sometimes. And the reason that this is pertinent is because Gretchen was friends with both of these girls. She was friends with the girl, now woman, who brought all this information to police, as well as friends with Creepy McCreeperson's daughter. And this girl, again, now woman, actually wrote in her diary as a child how creepy she thought her friend's dad was. And she even at one point wrote a passage about Gretchen and about how she thought that maybe her friend's dad could be responsible for what had happened to her. And this passage stated verbatim, "I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." Z for Zanstra, David Zanstra, referred to throughout this story primarily as Reverend Zanstra. This woman was alleging that this well-respected man of the cloth, this man that was friends with the Harrington family, this man who presided over Gretchen's funeral, this woman was alleging that he could have possibly been the one to blame for her death all this time. Obviously, this is a massive allegation, which the woman was able to back up with her diary entry. Not that the diary entry was anything other than circumstantial, but that paired with her allegations of David Zanstra groping her in her sleep, well, it was certainly enough to cast suspicion in his direction, that's for sure. Following this allegation, police immediately tracked down David Zanstra. They found that he was living in Marietta, Georgia, and they packed up, rolled out, and made their way to interrogate him. They began their interrogation of David Zanstra by confronting him with the information that had been provided by the informant, the allegations that he'd groped her as a child, and much to their surprise, Zanstra pretty willingly confessed to having been inappropriate with the girl. From there, police pivoted to Gretchen and what had happened to her, and much to their surprise again, Zanstra also confessed to Gretchen's kidnapping and to her murder. Absolutely mind-blowing. Right? This man who claimed to have been the one to notice that she was missing. This man who searched alongside Gretchen's grieving parents for her. This man who had the audacity to accept the request to preside over her funeral. Gretchen's best friend's dad and a beloved and trusted pastor. All along, he'd been the one who'd kidnapped and murdered her. Absolutely disgusting. And that is why I said earlier that maybe it was for the best that Harold wasn't around to find out who was responsible for what had happened to his daughter, because I cannot even imagine the feeling of knowing that I had sat and watched the man who killed my child speak at their funeral. The thought of it makes me physically ill. Like, I cannot. According to Zanstra, he was on his way to Bible study that morning, just driving along, when he noticed that Gretchen was walking by herself to the church. I mentioned before that typically Gretchen walked to the church with her sisters, but that on that day in particular, she had been walking alone. So Zanstra sees this, he pulls over, and he asks Gretchen if she wants to hop in and he'll give her a ride to the church. And that is what is so scary about this. It wasn't some stranger that pulled up and forcibly snatched up Gretchen. This man was not only the pastor of a church, but he was her best friend's dad. I am telling you right now that as a child, I would have accepted the ride too. And I'm sure a lot of you that are around my same age would have done the same. When we were kids, it was all about stranger danger. Don't trust strangers, don't talk to strangers, don't get in the car with strangers. Adults never really took the time to explain to us the difference between a safe and an unsafe adult. Instead, they basically taught us that anyone we know is safe and that anyone we don't know is unsafe. And while sure, I completely understand the idea of being weary of people we don't know sometimes. The truth of the matter is that more often than not, it's not strangers that do these terrible things. Statistically speaking, it is much more likely that things like what happened to Gretchen will happen at the hands of someone trusted and someone close to the victim. Gretchen had absolutely no reason to feel unsafe with this man. She happily and confidently accepted the ride. What did she have to fear? I mean, unfortunately, everything, apparently, because this man was disgusting. Once Zanstra had Gretchen in the vehicle, instead of taking her to the church, as he'd promised, he instead drove her to Ridley Creek State Park, to the secluded location she was ultimately discovered at. He had her get out of the car, where he then instructed her to undress. But Gretchen refused. She may have only been 8 years old, but she was so brave. And she was so smart. She knew that what he was asking of her wasn't right, and she refused to voluntarily submit to him. So that is when, according to Zanstra, he began to pleasure himself to completion. And if that wasn't egregious enough, knowing that what he'd just done was heinous, rather than risking getting caught and rather than allowing Gretchen the opportunity to tell someone what he had done, Zanstra claims to have then beaten Gretchen to death. Now, none of this explains why Gretchen's clothing was removed, and this makes me wonder if perhaps after she was dead, Zanstra went on to do unspeakable things to her body. But at the time I'm filming this, I don't think that that has been determined one way or another. That is just my own personal speculation. Either way, once he was done murdering and defiling this poor, innocent, sweet, trusting little girl, Zanstra then made his way to the church for Bible study, where he went on to act as if nothing had happened. He went about his morning, completely routine, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, as word began to spread, this man smiled in the faces of Harold and Ina and feigned support for them as he participated in searches for their daughter, as he brought them food that his wife had prepared for them. It is just absolutely sickening and reprehensible that a person could do something like this and then still pretend to be friendly with their victims' parents. To watch them in pain and to pretend to be there for them, pretend to support them, that is like a completely new level of depravity. It is truly vile. Over the next almost 5 decades, David Zanstra and his family moved around from place to place as David took numerous different open positions at different churches. California, New Jersey, Texas, just all over the map until ultimately they settled in Marietta, Georgia, where he took on a role at the Christian Reformed Church until he was arrested. Following the arrest of one of their pastors, CRC released a statement that read, "We want to extend our condolences to the family of Gretchen Harrington. We are additionally grieved to hear that a CRC pastor has been arrested for her murder. We recognize that we live in a broken and sinful world where violence can happen anywhere by anyone, even within our churches and by leaders that we hold to the highest standards." Currently, David Zanstra is being held in jail in Georgia. Pennsylvania is working diligently on the extradition process. A process, mind you, that Zanstra had initially waived, but shortly after he'd made that decision, his counsel opted to retract the waiver. Regardless, though, it's just a matter of time and formalities before Zanstra is extradited from Georgia to Pennsylvania, where he will face repercussions for what he's done. He's currently being charged with criminal homicide, so while the prosecution will do their best to present a case for first-degree murder, thus obtaining the harshest possible sentence, it will ultimately come down to the jury's decision on whether Zanstra will be convicted of first, second, or third-degree murder. Then, on top of his criminal homicide charge, Zanstra is also facing charges for kidnapping a minor, as well as a charge for the possession of an instrument of crime. And what I take that to mean is that the prosecution must not believe that Zanstra beat Gretchen to death with his bare hands. I think they believe that he used some sort of instrument to do so. Tire iron, tree branch, rock, I'm not sure, but that's what I personally take that charge to mean. Now, it should go without saying that given what he's admitted to doing, he deserves a harsh sentence. No doubt about it. That said, though, given his age, which I actually don't know if I mentioned, the man's 83, and based on his mugshot, he don't look so good. So it leads me to believe that no matter what he's ultimately convicted of, the man's gonna die in prison. I mean, he looks like a gently alive corpse at best as it is, so... The Delaware County District Attorney's Office collected Zanstra's DNA upon his arrest, and they've announced that they will be comparing his sample to any and all DNA samples they have available in any open cases. District Attorney Jack Stolzmeyer has also urged anyone with any potentially pertinent information regarding David Zanstra to come forward, stating, "We're concerned that there may be more victims who might have been sexually assaulted by this man, and if possible, we want to hold him accountable for everything he did." And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there were more victims along the way, because we know that he groped another one of his daughter's friends, and we know what he did to Gretchen, all with no repercussions, so why wouldn't he go on and repeat the offense? Because it didn't really ever seem to cause him any trouble. According to the state trooper that Zanstra confessed to, the confession apparently seemed like a relief, as if it was a weight coming off of his shoulders. And I don't know if that means he's sorry or not. It might just mean that after 50 years of looking over his shoulder, motherfucker might just be tired, you know? And if that's the case, he should just plead guilty and spare the family a trial. Spare them having to relive what happened to Gretchen, and spare them having to reopen these wounds that they've worked 48 years to heal from. Following Zanstra's arrest, Gretchen's family did release a statement to the public. They said that the arrest made them feel like they were one step closer to justice, and then they went on to issue a statement of remembrance for Gretchen, stating, quote, "If you met Gretchen, you were instantly her friend. She exuded kindness to all and was sweet and gentle. Even now, when people share their memories of her, the first thing they talk about is how amazing she was, and still is. At just 8 years old, she had a lifelong impact on those around her. And you know what? I think that that is a perfect place and a beautiful sentiment to end today's video on. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Thank you again so much to Elena for requesting this one. I love sharing cold cases like this that get solved because hopefully it can serve as a reminder to families like Gretchen's, as well as to sick freaks like David Zanstra, that most of the time these cases will be solved, even if it does take a while. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked down below in the description box, which is also where you'll find all of the details and the links for all the products I use throughout today's video. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos almost every week. I post for 4 consecutive weeks and then I take a scheduled skip week. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always know when I do post and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. This looks super cute and I'm probably about to ruin it. Only time will tell. This is a bold ass move. Bold ass move. Oh my god, what is the word I'm looking for? Oh, bitch. My necklace was backwards this whole time and ain't none of y'all tell me. Ugh. Is it necessary to clip up these stupid little wings of hair? Probably not. Am I gonna do it anyway? You betcha. I'm scared. I had a lip liner and here it is.